So we welcome Chairman Mike Simpson to present the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill. Chairman. Hold your applause.
No, don't. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I'm glad to present the committee with the fiscal year 2015 Energy and Water Bill, but before I go into the recommendations, I'd like to thank Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Loy for their hard work to get us back to regular order. I think it says a lot about the Appropriations Committee that we're actually doing our job and trying to get back to regular order. I'd also like to thank my ranking member, Ms. Capter, for her help in putting together this recommendation. She's a passionate advocate for her constituents and has a keen interest in the issues overseen by our subcommittee. This recommendation is better because of her contributions, and I thank you for that. And also all of the members of the subcommittee. One of the members of our subcommittee, Mr. Nunley, as you all know, is in recovery, and as I understand, the latest word is that he's doing well, so we wish him the best. But all the members of the subcommittee contributed to this, and also the staff on both sides of the aisle has taken a great deal of time and effort to try to address the concerns of all members of not only the Appropriations Committee, but of Congress in general. The legislation before you totals $34.01 billion for the activities of the Department of Energy, Army Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, and other agencies under our jurisdiction. This is a $50 million reduction from last year's funding levels. This is a strong bill and one which recognizes the importance of investing in the nation's infrastructure and national defense. Importantly, this recommendation overcomes the budget request proposed to cut nearly $1 billion of critical programs for the Army Corps of Engineers. The request would have led to economic disruptions at as our ports and waterways filled in, and would have left our communities and businesses vulnerable to flooding. Instead, this recommendation recognizes the critical work of the Corps and provides $5.492 billion for those activities, $959 million above the request and $25 million above last year. Somebody was competing. More than $1.1 billion is provided for the activities supported by the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, an increase of at least $185 million over the budget request. Over $916 million is provided to support projects either inadequately funded or not funded at all in the budget request, but only after the administration reports to us on how they will prioritize these funds. The recommendation takes a strong stand against government overreach by prohibiting changes to the definitions of waters of the United States and fill materials, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to debate those once again in this subcommittee, or in this full committee. The recommendation also provides $11.361 billion for the Atomic Security, Nonproliferation, and Naval Reactors programs for the National Nuclear Security Administration, a $154 million increase from fiscal year 2014. Unfortunately, given the limitations posed by the Ryan Murray budget deal, we were not able to fully fund all of our priorities. We were, however, able to substantially improve upon the President's request. The nuclear weapons program run by the Department of Energy receives $8.2 billion, an increase of $423 million from last year. All critical life extension programs are fully funded, and infrastructure projects needed to sustain our national defense are fully supported. Our non-proliferation programs are funded at $1.55 billion, the same as the request. This is a significant cut, nearly $400 million from last year, which we could not make up. However, within this figure, we made changes to move nearly $250 million in stalled funding to projects that will actively help protect against proliferation in fiscal year 2015. Of this, $100 million is from projects in the budget request that would take place in Russia. To be clear, there is no new funding in this recommendation for activities in Russia. There is also a requirement that before the Secretary of Energy funds any activities in Russia, he must certify that the activity is in our national security interests. Colleagues, many of us have been reminded by Russia's actions that the end of the Cold War has not brought stability to Eastern Europe. Our NATO colleagues and others who live under the security umbrella that our nuclear arsenal provides are nervous, and now is not the time to imply in any way that our nuclear weapons are not needed. We've also seen once again how energy can both be used as a geostrategic weapon and be affected by strategic actions. Russia has used Ukraine's reliance on natural gas to put pressure on its new leadership, and the movements by insurgents to occupy Iraq threaten to drive oil prices through the roof. That's why this bill makes strong, balanced investments in our energy sector to ensure that our constituents continue to have reliable, affordable energy. Fossil energy, which provides more than 71% of our electricity production in 2013, receives $593 million, a $31 million increase above fiscal year 2014. Nuclear energy is increased by $10 million above last year. Energy efficiency and renewable energy are slightly reduced by $113 million from last year. This balanced investment prioritizes improvements to energy sources that we rely upon today while making longer-term investments in alternative energy sources. My colleagues, I'll stop here. However, I fully expect that today and on the floor, many of us will have further contributions to propose to this bill, and I look forward to these discussions. I thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before proceeding, I noticed that we have with us today a University of Alabama cheerleader, and I wonder if the gentlelady would introduce her to us.
This is my daughter, Margaret.
Margaret. Mr. Serrano? I'm sorry. Ms. Captor, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, I want to congratulate you on the bipartisan and transparent manner in which you crafted the fiscal 2015 energy and water bill. It's really been very enjoyable working as a subcommittee, and I want to express my gratitude to Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Lowy, who has come to every meeting of every subcommittee, and the other members of our subcommittee for their sincere efforts. And finally, I would like to thank the majority subcommittee staff, Rob, and your personal staff for their great work, as well as Tanya Berquam on our side for her expertise, diligence, and hard work, and Ryan Stayer of my own staff for working overtime all the time. I also want to, at our side of the aisles, good wishes to Mr. Nunnally. We miss his humor and his melodic cadence on the subcommittee. And I just have to say to Mr. Pastor, who's this would be the last energy and water meeting, we thank him very much for the vision and the shoulder-to-the-wheel attitude he always expressed in his sense of humor on our subcommittee. It has made it a pleasure, and we wish him the very best as he embarks on a new phase in his life. As we evaluate the bill before us, I might say it's one of the most important bills Congress considers. I would like to briefly provide some context. Often when I address graduation assemblies, I generally tell the audiences that I am in the liberty business. Our energy and water bill today is about liberty's business. It is about national security. It is about energy security. It is about jobs and economic growth here at home. Our accounts, every single one of them, spur energy innovation. They feed construction of an America on the grow and the jobs that attend that, and they assure the nuclear security that can defend our nation. All these accounts are tightly bound in our subcommittee bill. From Michael Clare's incisive book, Blood and Oil, we learn about what some might call the most significant test to liberty in our time. He says every economic recession since World War II has come on the heels of a global petroleum shortage. To name a few, look back to the Arab oil embargo and OPEC price increases of 1973 and 4, followed on by the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, to the costly wars we have been enduring in Iraq and Afghanistan. The current crisis in Iraq, as well as the predicament Ukraine and Greater Europe face as winter approaches, all point fiercely in the direction of energy. As gasoline prices here at home now bob and rise, related to what's happening in other places in the world, rising in some locales up to $4 a gallon, we recall that the $4 price level is the tripwire for our economy slipping back into recession again. If we look back at history, since the creation of CENTCOM in 1983, almost all the American soldiers who died in combat were serving under its authority, including the victims of terrorist attacks at the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia in 1996 and aboard the USS Cole in 2000. The link between blood, the politics of energy, and terrorism plagues our political reality. Ultimately, on 9/11, as Yemen terrorists slammed into our shores, the Statue of Liberty witnessed the dawn of the 21st century. The U.S. military itself is largely dependent on petroleum. As Robert E. Abel of the Center for Strategic and International Studies said in 2002, oil fuels military power, national treasuries, and international politics. And petroleum products account for over 90% still of all fuel used by America's mammoth fleet of cars, trucks, buses, planes, trains, and ships. In the last century, American reliance on foreign oil grew. And there are plenty of charts in front of you to peruse. Our share of imports in the nation's total annual energy supply rose from 42% in 1990 to 49% in 1997, and then in April 1998, it crossed the 50% mark. The U.S. entered the 21st century with a net reliance on foreign oil. Based on the charts you have in hand, you can observe where the imports are coming from and where reserves remain. In addition, one can gain a sense of, despite U.S. natural gas discoveries, how reliant the U.S. remains on imported product. In my sincere judgment, this posture of energy dependence and our over-reliance on one input is simply too great a risk to liberty for our nation. We must propel a course adjustment, and this bill does its small part toward that task. Just since 2003, the United States has spent $2.3 trillion importing foreign petroleum. $2.3 trillion. This is a vast shift of wealth, and thousands upon 10,000s of jobs from the U.S. elsewhere. Assuming a $30 barrel price, which Claire did in his book, the total bill for imported oil over the next 25 years should reach over $3.5 trillion or more. But if you look at the spot market in New York and the Wall Street Journal's reporting on what's happening as a result of the unsettlement of the Middle East, the price now is closer to $100 a barrel. So we're talking about a shift of wealth of over $10 trillion. This is an enormous hemorrhage for the American people. How serious are we in restoring liberty for the next generations? Each of us must ask ourselves this question. Just this week, the fear of an oil price shock related to Iraq unrest has put Wall Street on an oil price watch. On Monday, prices stabilized, with a barrel of oil falling 20 cents in price, and now it only costs $106.57 per barrel. Theoretically, we could just keep hemorrhaging. The job loss associated with the trillions of dollars of abdicated energy wealth is staggering. It is a major contributing factor. It is the major contributing factor to the shrinkage of our middle class, because it is a continuing hemorrhage of wealth, jobs, and economic power. The bill before us today attempts to take a modest step forward in diversifying America's energy sources. Frankly, based on the challenge that has faced us for almost a third of a century, I would like to triple the size of this budget to get to a solution for liberty and security faster. Congress must restore energy security for our nation through innovation, and that firm commitment will leave the next generation in greater control of this country and their own lives. Recent natural gas discoveries, which one of the charts graphs, and added domestic drilling provide our nation with some breathing room, but only for a while. An energy-hungry world will continue to push up global prices and availability. This is the world we are living in, and it is changing. And so America must adapt, and adapt sooner rather than later. President Jimmy Carter was not wrong when he equated the struggle for energy independence as the moral equivalent of war. We have been engaged in plenty of fighting abroad, and we must refocus and draw forth the powers of our own land, performing something worthy to be remembered. The $34 billion in this bill cannot correct the ship of state's direction overnight, but surely as we change course and invest more robustly in our own nation's energy future again across all energy sectors, we can begin to restore some of the economic luster we know has been lost and is but waiting for us to reignite its potential. By 2035, projections show we will be able to meet 97% of our energy needs through domestic production if we act smartly. Energy-efficient upgrades to vehicles, buildings, and industrial processes have slowed the growth of consumption. These must continue. On the supply side, increases in domestic production are largely driven by natural gas discoveries using drilling technology that was advanced due to this committee's investment in research at the Department of Energy with the horizontal drilling technologies and others. Continued funding to accelerate renewable energy development can help achieve a net positive balance of trade in our energy sector. But make no mistake about it, China and other countries are not only stealing innovation, but they are investing enormous amounts in the renewable sector, and we must maintain our vigilance. Alternatively, if we underinvest in the critical technologies of the future, we risk wasting our moment in history and ceding our energy future and liberty to our global competitors. With this in mind, on the bill before us, as the chairman has pointed out, the allocation for this bill is flat compared to it's the same as 2014 essentially. And I know, Mr. Chairman, you were faced with very difficult decisions, in particular with the defense allocation. Despite these challenges, the product before us is a good bill and one which I support. There are, of course, a few provisions which I object to that I hope we can rectify as we move forward, and I'm convinced if we do not make strategic investments in our physical and research infrastructure, we are risking the economic competitiveness of our nation. The bill before us grapples with these important national decisions that will shape this century's America. The bill adds nearly $1 billion to the Corps of Engineers funding necessary to complete work already underway, but there are no new starts. And the Army Corps of Engineers has a $60 billion backlog. What a job creator that would be if we could fund it. If we are to maintain our ports and waterways and provide flood and storm damage reduction projects where they make sense, we must modernize our critical infrastructure investments. In almost every circumstance, it makes more fiscal sense to prevent a disaster than to respond to one, so this bill allows the Corps to address some national needs not supported by the administration's requests. The science and ARPA-E accounts, critical for U.S. competitiveness and scientific innovation, are just the same as last year, essentially. I do have concerns with amounts provided to certain accounts within the bill, in particular the level of funding for the non-proliferation activities of the National Security Agency and the Defense Environmental Cleanup accounts, where despite the chairman's best efforts, the subcommittee's allocation was simply insufficient. And finally, while the funding levels of the bill are fair, we do have concerns about the Clean Water Act prohibition and the prohibition for the Corps of Engineers using funds related to fill material definitions. But in spite of these, I'd like to reiterate my appreciation to the chairman for his work on these many issues, and to say I look forward to working with you and the members of the committee to advance the process and complete the task before us to strengthen liberty as she encounters the major challenges of a new era. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members.
Congratulations to both Chairman Simpson and Ranking Member Kaptur for producing a well-thought-out, reasonable bill. This is Chairman Simpson's first bill at the helm of the Energy and Water Subcommittee. I want to commend him for his fine work, bringing us up to speed and bringing, I think, a good bill before the committee today. The Energy and Water Appropriations Bill has three clear priorities: reinforcing our national defense through nuclear security; secondly, boosting our economy by facilitating important infrastructure projects and investing in American energy; and third, holding the line on federal spending. In this bill, he targets the funding toward programs that focus on these goals and reduced spending where prudent and where it's in the best interest of the country. Funding for nuclear weapons programs has been increased above last year's level to maintain the safety and readiness of our nuclear stockpile. As we face an ever-changing global landscape, upholding our nuclear deterrence posture and preparing for any future nuclear threats remains extremely important to our national security. The bill also protects funding for the Army Corps of Engineers, providing a slight increase above last year's enacted level and nearly $1 billion more than what the President requested. Army Corps programs have an immediate, direct impact on public safety and our economy and help facilitate trade and commerce valued at more than $1.7 trillion each year. It's our duty to ensure that the Army Corps can continue its important work updating dam safety, performing flood mitigation, and improving our waterways. Environmental cleanup is also important to the safety and well-being of communities across the country, and this legislation provides $5.6 billion to address nuclear cleanup and other environmental management activities. Within the Department of Energy, the bill prioritizes funding for energy programs that encourage economic competitiveness and that utilize our nation's vast natural resources. We make sound investments in coal, natural gas, and other fossil energy sources. Investing research dollars in these critical areas will push us toward greater energy independence and will help keep energy costs down for Americans across the country. While advancing energy and infrastructure that will grow the American economy, the legislation also puts the brakes on the Obama administration's destructive and misguided regulations. For example, the bill rolls back damaging regulatory attacks on small business and other industries by prohibiting unnecessary changes to federal jurisdiction over our nation's waterways. This proposal is deeply concerning on many levels, not the least of which is the unknown costs associated with what is clearly a massive and intrusive change in federal regulation. I want to call it the biggest land grab in American history. In her own testimony before the subcommittee just a few weeks ago, the Assistant Secretary for the Corps expressed bewilderment and confusion as to how much these regulations would cost the American taxpayer, how many man-hours it would take to implement, how such a change would benefit our already struggling economy. The Corps clearly does not know what it's doing on this and is setting the stage for yet another regulatory disaster. In addition to addressing this new waters rule, the bill also prohibits changes in the definition of, quote, fill material, quote, which could effectively shut down coal and other mining operations throughout the country. In addition to fighting these onerous regulations and advancing our national security and economic interests, the bill also keeps a close eye on our federal coffers. In total, the bill provides $50 million less than last year, reflecting the tough decisions needed to restore balance to the federal budget. The subcommittee assessed each and every program funded by this legislation and targeted lower priority programs for reductions. For instance, renewable energy programs are cut by $113 million from last year's level. And the bill contains vigorous oversight requirements over how the Department of Energy, the Army Corps, and other agencies are spending taxpayer dollars. In summation, I think this is a well-balanced, responsible bill. It reflects careful budget decisions. It invests tax dollars in proven, effective, and needed programs. And I want to commend Chairman Simpson, Ranking Member Capter, the members of the subcommittee, and the staff for their careful work on this bill, and I urge the committee to support it. Now we turn to Mrs. Lowy for her opening remarks.
Before I begin, I want to wish our subcommittee colleague, Congressman Nunley, a speedy recovery. Our thoughts and prayers are with him and his family. I thank Chairman Simpson and Ranking Member Capter, whose bipartisan cooperation and hard work are evident in the bill before us today. which adequately invests in a number of important programs that have strong Democratic support. While I certainly don't agree with all of its measures, I will support it. Level funding for ARPA-E and the Office of Science are critical for developing cutting-edge technologies, maintaining our scientific workforce. The Corps of Engineers is also funded at almost $1 billion above the President's request, continuing the subcommittee's strong support for water infrastructure investments. While I applaud the chairman for prioritizing these accounts, they underscore the constraints of virtually flat discretionary spending. According to the American Society for Civil Engineers, underinvestment in our marine ports and inland waterways endangers more than 1 million U.S. jobs, $270 billion in U.S. exports by 2020. Additionally, while our total science and research and development spending remains flat, other countries are making substantial progress and in some instances jumping ahead. A better allocation would allow additional investments in priority areas to grow our economy more quickly and help the United States maintain its position as the global leader in innovation. Frankly, I'd like to read that paragraph about 5 times because there's a lot of discussion around here about creating jobs, strengthening our economy. Well, this is the way to do it. And although this is a good bill, it's not good enough, and we have to continue to work to make investments because that's the way we create jobs and strengthen our economy and maintain our position as global leader in innovation. While I strongly disagree with the $113 million cut to energy efficiency and renewable energy account and funding levels to specific programs within the account, the overall level is more than $1 billion above what this subcommittee recommended last year. I also oppose funding the fossil energy account at $117.5 million above the President's request. Our country is home to a robust fossil fuels industrial base that makes over $100 billion annually in profits. In light of our tight allocation, too many other priorities that are unfortunate enough to benefit from robust private sector R&D spending should be better supported by this bill. I would be remiss if I didn't object to the inclusion of 2 riders related to the definition of fill materials and navigable waters under the Clean Water Act. The Corps of Engineers and EPA recently released a proposed rule regarding navigable waters. Their work needs to move forward in order to address the ambiguity created by Supreme Court rulings in 2002 and 2006. Despite strong disagreements regarding the merits of the proposed rule, these issues should be resolved through the rulemaking process, not in this bill. Lastly, while this bill is a welcome surprise compared to previous bills before this subcommittee, it does not do nearly enough to address the incredibly damaging effects of climate change. Rising sea levels, increased flooding from torrential downpours and hurricanes like Sandy, demonstrate the overwhelming need to invest in new water infrastructure projects to safeguard our communities. Yet this subcommittee can't invest in new projects because its allocation is dwarfed by the growing backlog of ongoing projects, which includes projects that were authorized decades ago. Clearly, we aren't providing enough resources to quickly move important projects forward. Additionally, our investments in emerging energy technologies cling to outdated fossil fuel instead of doubling down on the promise of renewable energy. This slows the growth of our clean energy economy, which will not only power future job growth, but will also save lives by lessening the impact of climate change. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the ranking member again for your cooperation in producing this bill.
Thank the gentlelady. Are there further opening statements on the bill? Hearing Mrs. Lee.
Yes. First of all, Mr. Chairman, let me thank yourself and our ranking member for your very hard bipartisan work on this bill. And I'd like to especially cite and thank the majority and the minority for including important language in the bill related to the high energy physics account in the Department of Energy's Office of Science. That's in the manager's amendment, so thank you very much. I just want to explain this very briefly. High energy physics, it's a sector that's providing us with tremendous breakthroughs in our understanding of the nature of our universe. I'm concerned that in this bill, though, that there's not enough funding for renewable energy at the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis. This, again, is a joint project of the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs and also from the California Institute of Technology, that's Caltech, along with other partners throughout California. This initiative is really a critical project in our national effort to develop renewable fuels, which we know will keep our nation competitive in the global economy while protecting our environment. So I look forward to working with both the majority and the minority as this bill moves to the floor and into conference. Hopefully we can put the funding into this bill because it's truly vital to our national, entire national energy strategy. Thank you again.
There being no further general discussion, are there amendments?
Mr. Chairman
Simpson.
I have an amendment, a manager's amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Simpson.
Without objection, the
Read.
reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized.
Before I talk about the manager's amendment, let me also echo the words of my ranking member, Ms. Kaptur. This is the last markup of the Energy and Water Committee that Mr. Pastor will be on, and he has truly been a friend to me personally while I've been in Congress, and he's been a great member of the Energy and Water Committee, and I've enjoyed having you there, and thank you for your not only your input on this bill, but your work for this country over the years.
Amen.
The amendment includes several non-controversial report language additions which have been fully vetted and agreed to by the majority and minority. The amendment includes report language regarding small harbors, STEM education, public review of the social cost of carbon, residential water heaters, astrophysics experiments, uranium transfer notifications, and a Nuclear Regulatory Commission management review. The amendment also includes bill and report language clarifying requirements for the NRC responsiveness to congressional requests for information. Finally, the amendment would strike language in the bill regarding California water issues. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment.
Ms. Kaptur.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we support the amendment. We have no.
Is there discussion? Hearing none, the question is on the Simpson manager's amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments? Mr. Moran.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one of your favorites that I'd like to offer again. It's amendment number 1.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Moran.
Go
Page
ahead
10.
and read it. It's only
Page 10, beginning on line 20, strike section 106.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment is simple. Section 106 of this bill would prevent the Corps of Engineers from finalizing its proposed regulation clarifying the limits of federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. It's not a new debate for this committee, obviously, nor for you or for the chairman of the subcommittee. Now, I'll try to ignore the fact that this is obvious authorization on an appropriations bill, but will I be consistent about that? So let me get into the substance of the amendment. The only thing that has changed since we debated this issue a year ago is that this time the Obama administration has actually followed the advice of some in the majority and issued a proposed rule instead of a guidance, which we had last year. And that rule clarifies the limits of federal authority under the Clean Water Act. Virtually everyone agrees that clarity is needed. Calls for EPA to issue a rule came from such notable organizations as the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the American Farm Bureau Federation, the International Council of Shopping Centers, the Western Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers. They all wanted clarity. Now, they didn't necessarily agree with everything in the rule, but they want clarity. Prohibiting EPA from finalizing the rule, as this authorization piece of Section 106 would direct, would perpetuate the confusion for still another year. Now, as you know, and the distinguished minority leader referenced the two Supreme Court cases that are relevant to this. In both cases, no majority of the court could agree on where federal jurisdiction should end. But contrary to some of my colleagues' claims that may be made this morning, the court never stated that federal jurisdiction ends at the point that a water body is no longer navigable by boat. No Supreme Court justice, not one of them, ruled that the Clean Water Act can only protect physically navigable waters, because the original Clean Water Act defines navigable waters broadly to include the waters of the United States. So the administration's proposed rule clarifies that most seasonal and rain-dependent streams are protected. Wetlands near rivers and streams are protected. And with respect to other types of waters that may have more uncertain connections with downstream water, protection will be evaluated through a case-specific analysis of whether that connection is or isn't significant. EPA has encouraged recommendations from the public for how best to determine whether a water body has significant connection to downstream waters. Now, I think it's terribly important that we bear in mind that 59% of all stream miles in the lower 48 states fall into the category of intermittent or ephemeral. In other words, they don't exist for part of the year, yet they receive 40% of all individual wastewater discharges. More than 117 million Americans get some of their drinking water from these very streams that don't flow year-round. Including this rider to block EPA's rule will only ensure that the confusion continues and that these sources of drinking water remain at increased risk of pollution. And with rising temperatures, more severe droughts that we continue to see, and climate change, the protection of our waters and wetlands are more important than ever. Before we should consider the argument, though, that we don't need to worry because the states have authority in the absence of federal authority, I think it's important to bring up the point that that argument, Mr. Chairman, doesn't hold water in states that use the federal definition to run their program. The states use the federal definition. 48 states share common water bodies. That's why you need the federal role. Without federal jurisdiction, no state can tell an upstream state what to do unless we have a baseline minimum federal standard that all states have to abide by. If states didn't share this concern, why did 33 states file briefs in support of preserving federal Clean Water Act authority? The truth is that a wide variety of waters have already been denied Clean Water Act safeguards. So we have no clarity, though, now over what's called other waters, such as intrastate waters and waters susceptible to interstate commerce. They're in legal limbo because they weren't clearly or consistently covered in case law, but are part of the 86 Reagan regulations. The inconsistent, conflicting interpretations still abound, particularly of the project in question happens to straddle multiple Army Corps districts. Now, this underscores the problem. Under the status quo, each of the 38 Corps district offices can apply a different test for determining what waters and wetlands are covered by the Clean Water Act and which aren't. And in fact, when you have highways and power lines that cut across multiple watersheds and state boundaries, the same project can have conflicting determinations of what constitutes a covered water. We have to end this confusion. We've had a public comment process and appropriate congressional oversight. I think we need to allow the administration to move forward on a formal rulemaking process. Or we could define navigable water. We write legislation and appropriation bills all the time. Maybe we want to do that, but I'm not sure why we would when we can complain about the administration doing it. So the proposed rule respects agriculture by maintaining all of the existing exemptions for agricultural discharges and waters. It identifies specific types of water bodies to which it doesn't apply, like artificial lakes and ponds and many types of drainage and irrigation districts. It doesn't extend federal protection to any waters not historically protected under the Clean Water Act, and it's fully consistent with the law and the decisions of the Supreme Court. So I really think we ought to go forward and provide greater clarity, and to do so, we need to strike Section 106. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I strongly oppose your amendment. The general provision in this bill is meant to stop regulatory overreach by the EPA and this administration, an issue which is of critical importance to most members of this committee and certainly the country. The rule proposed by the EPA earlier this year would expand federal jurisdiction well beyond the limits of the Supreme Court decisions, claiming jurisdiction over even those streams that only flow seasonally or after a heavy rain. As I recollect, the constitutional basis upon which EPA and the government is allowed to act is whether or not these are navigable streams. Now, I want the ticket concession to sell tickets, Mr. Moran, when you are trying to swim up that dry gulch. That's all I ask. I mean, these are not streams. These are wash-offs. These are runoffs. You can't navigate a dry bed. Navigable means to be able to navigate. And navigate means to be able to take a boat or a ship through a stream. These are dry gulches. What's the Spanish word for it? Arroyo. These are arroyos. And they're all over the country, particularly in the West, but even in my district. And if you assert jurisdiction over those so-called dry streams, you're going to cover jurisdiction of the entire country. You couldn't build a highway, you couldn't build a shopping center, you couldn't build a store, you couldn't mine coal, you couldn't mine rock and quarry and so forth without a permit from the EPA and the Corps of Engineers in Washington, D.C. You talk about bureaucratic chaos. And so for those modest reasons, I ask that we reject this amendment. Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I support the Moran amendment. I was thinking that when I was born, there were 146 million people in our country. Today there are 310 million, and there's not any more water. It's becoming more scarce. I'm amazed even in some of the bills over which I have something to say, how much environmental cleanup remains to be done in our country. And the question is, are we going to protect our waters for future generations, our clean waters? And even if streams dry up for a while, but they're subject to wash-throughs, you will wash through what is not healthy into adjoining bodies. It's just the way the world works. I believe the Moran Amendment would allow the Corps not overreach, but rather the needed flexibility to deal with the confusion that has reigned in light of 2 Supreme Court decisions. Without this amendment, the bill would result in increased implementation cost to federal and state resource agencies as well as the regulatory community. It would increase delays in the implementation of important public works projects, and we sure don't need any more delays in that, and it would result in protracted litigation on the disparity between existing federal regulations and these two court decisions. We really need to be investing in clean water infrastructure for the country. We have to build the country forward. It's a different country than when I was born, and by 2050 we expect there will be 500 million people in this country. We cannot behave like it is 1946. Further, the current provision does not apply just to this year. It applies to any year, both past and future, in the Energy and Water Development Act, ensuring that the uncertainty continues indefinitely. We should be allowing the Corps to take actions that address the Supreme Court rulings, bringing clarity and certainty to the regulatory process, not prolonging the confusion, and also supporting clean water for the people of our country. I urge my colleagues to support the Moran Amendment.
Chairman Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe with the government ought to sometime think about that we are individual states that have an individual situation. I've pointed out before in this argument that it affects all the land titles of everybody that borders on a stream anywhere in the state of Texas, because our land titles are based upon navigable waterways versus non-navigable waterways. If you live next to a non-navigable waterway, you own to the middle of the stream. If your land borders on a navigable waterway, you own to the cutbank. That's the way our statutes are written across the board. So let me just tell you about something that people are tired of the federal government coming in and getting in the middle of their world, because they come in with loopholes that allows them to come in and shut down progress on what they do. There's a little town, I want you to go get a Texas topographical map, and I want you to look at, for a little town called Ozona, Texas. Okay? It is 80 miles from the nearest stream. But when the drought broke in 1956, our 70-year drought in 1956, a wall of water went through Ozona, Texas, 40 feet deep and wiped out the entire town. Now they've got a dam built which has never held any water, because since the drought, they haven't had that runoff. But the topographical map will show you that the arroyos, the dry streams, ran down to the low point and went out through Crockett County, and there was a 40-foot wall of water. Under the way the EPA is defining navigable waterways with this new definition, half of the state of Texas would have, the EPA would have access to regulate water in all areas. We have ranches that the cattle only can drink underground water. There's no trapped water on those ranches. They're too dry. But you get a huge storm, water runs through those ranches. Arizona's got the same thing. And if anywhere water flows that will ultimately reach the ocean or reach another river, is going to be covered by the federal government. It's a massive intrusion upon the personal lives of the landowners of those states. And quite honestly, I'm tired of the federal government intruding on the landowners' rights in our state, and I violently oppose this, and I ask for a no vote.
Violently opposed?
Violent.
Ms. McCullum.
Start talking about water in Texas, you liable to get shot.
Ms. McCullum.
Thank you. Without any violence in my speech, I'm from Minnesota, the headwaters of the Mississippi. And you can walk across, if you're not afraid of breaking an ankle or a wrist on the slippery rocks by Lake Itasca. You can walk across, leap across, and sometimes it's pretty dry up there at the headwaters of the Mississippi. But I want you to do a little bit of geography homework when you can, next time you're with your iPad, and look at the headwaters of the Mississippi, and then kind of scan out and have Google Maps just show you all the rivers, all the tributaries, and everything that flows into the mighty Mississippi before it gets down to the Gulf of Mexico. Look, if you're one of the 10 states that's part of the Mississippi Parkway region, look and see how many people that you represent, if you're on one of those states, that drink from the Mississippi River. Now, all the farmland, all the waste, everything that's moving forward, all of those little tributaries come together and go into the Mississippi River. Now, I could talk about the Minnesota River, the St. Croix River, other rivers in Minnesota. But we're working in Minnesota to improve our water quality for the next generation. We're trying to protect water because we know, even in Minnesota, that water shortages are happening, even in Minnesota. So I do think we have a responsibility to work collectively as the 50 states and our territories to protect drinking water, not only for today, but for tomorrow. And so I support the Moran Amendment because we think that, you know, to Mr. Carter's points about people, you know, feeling violent about protecting water, just think what our children's generation is going to say. And I'm not kidding. Even in Minnesota, even in the Twin Cities, we are starting to look at a possible water shortage. We need to support the Moran Amendment and protect drinking water for future generations.
Chairman Simpson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I know that members have probably heard this discussion 6, 7, maybe 8 times in this committee, and Mr. Moran and I have had this in one fashion or another in the Interior Committee, where the EPA is funded, and also in the Army Corps of Engineers budget on this. But I strongly oppose this amendment. The general provision in this bill is intended to stop regulatory overreach, as the Chairman Rogers said. This is not legislating on an appropriation bill. This is a funding limitation amendment. No fund shall be used for. That's what we do. This is not legislating on an appropriation bill. All of the groups mentioned by Mr. Moran in his statement of wanting clarification, I believe every one of them is opposed to what the EPA is doing with this rule. Do they want clarification? You bet. Is this the clarification that they want? I doubt it. As I've said almost every time we've discussed this debate, you know, a hanging brings certainty and clarification to an issue, but I'm not sure it's the result you want. And that's pretty much what they're proposing here with the EPA. The term navigable waters has long been the phrase used which limits federal intrusion with regards to Clean Water Act's authority. Non-navigable waters are regulated by the states. And if you listen to the debate that Mr. Moran gave, you could use that argument to essentially eliminate state government and just let the federal government do everything. I don't think that's the right way to go. States can regulate non-navigable waters, and that's what they do today. And they do it differently in different states. I suspect some states do a better job than other states do. But in Idaho, we regulate the non-navigable waters and do it well. The Supreme Court, in 2 separate decisions, clearly stated that the Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency had gone too far and that federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act was not as broad as they had claimed. This spring, however, the administration proposed a rule that would greatly expand federal jurisdiction, including non-navigable intrastate waters. Deciding how water is used should be the responsibility of state and local officials who are familiar with the people and the local issues. Under the proposed rule, however, the reach of the federal jurisdiction would be so broad that it could significantly restrict landowners' ability to make decisions, as Mr. Carter said, about their property, and a local government's right to plan for its own development. Speaking for western states that don't have the water that they have in Minnesota, federal overreach of this scale would be disastrous. And in fact, the Western Governors Association, both Republicans and Democrats are on the Western Governors Association, have expressed concern about the administration's lack of consultation with the states and that the rulemaking could impinge on the states' authority of water management. The other scary part about this is this: while the EPA says that they're not talking about groundwater, in their connectivity rule, groundwater is connected to surface water. Eventually, they will start regulating groundwater. And if you really want to get into a Western water war, start talking about regulating groundwater. The ag exemptions mentioned by the gentleman from Virginia are not in the rule. They are not in the rule. They are advisory, can be changed at any given time. They don't have to go through a rulemaking process to change those ag exemptions. When asked why that was, the administrator said, well, we wanted more flexibility so that we could address these issues as they came up, which I respect, but guess what? they can also take away those exemptions without going through a rule process and a public hearing process. So there's no more certainty with those ag exemptions that they've given in there. While there may be a desire for clarity on the issue of federal jurisdiction, providing clarity does not trump the need to stay within the limits of the law. I hope the members will oppose this amendment, and reminding the administration that they cannot simply ignore the other two branches of government.
Is there further discussion? Hearing none, Mr. Moran is recognized to close.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important to bear in mind that states are still required to implement and enforce the Clean Water Act, and dischargers still have to obey it, and third parties can still file lawsuits. But blocking this regulation will frustrate the federal government's efforts to explain where a state or federal authority under the Clean Water Act ceases to exist. 33 states joined a brief in the most recent of the Supreme Court cases urging the court to uphold federal protections for wetlands adjacent to non-navigable tributaries, because the states said that these federal safeguards were critical because of water flows between states, because maintaining a federal floor of pollution control creates parity between states, the states that are where the water is coming from, the states that receive it, and because states have come to rely on federal protections and would face major administrative and financial burdens if they were solely responsible for these requirements. Many states have passed no more stringent rules that forbid state programs from becoming any more stringent than the Federal Clean Water Act and its rules. So you weaken the federal law, and then you affect the state laws. We ought not be doing this, Mr. Chairman, and I urge support of the amendment. Thank you.
Questions on the Moran amendment? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no.
No.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed.
Ask for a roll call vote.
Roll call is requested. A sufficient show of support. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Amadei? Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert? No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Crenshaw? No. Mr. Crenshaw, no. Mr. Cuellar? No. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson? No. Mr. Culberson, no. Ms. DeLauro? Aye. Ms. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Dent? No. Mr. Dent, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart? No. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Farr? Mr. Farr, aye. Mr. Fatah? Aye. Mr. Fatah, aye. Mr. Fleischman? No. Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? No. Mr. Fortenberry, no. Mr. Frelinghuysen? No. Mr. Frelinghuysen, no. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? No. Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Ferrero-Butler? No. Ms. Ferrero-Butler, no. Mr. Honda? Yes. Mr. Honda, aye. Mr. Joyce? No. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Aye. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Kingston, no. Mr. Latham? Mr. Latham, no. Ms. Lee? Aye. Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCollum? Ms. McCollum? Ms. McCollum, aye. Mr. Moran? Aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Nunley? Mr. Owens? No. Mr. Owens, no. Mr. Pastor? Aye. Mr. Pastor, aye. Ms. Pingree? Aye. Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Price? Aye. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Aye. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Aye. Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Rooney? No. Mr. Rooney, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Aye. Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Schiff? Aye. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Serrano? Aye. Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? No. Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? No. Mr. Stewart, no. Mr. Valadeo? No. Mr. Valadeo, no. Mr. Visklosky? Aye. Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, aye. Mr. Wolf? No. Mr. Wolf, no. Mr. Womack? No. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, no.
Are there members who wish to be recorded or change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 18, the nays are 31. The amendment is not agreed to. Mr. Dent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to ask.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Dent. At the end of Title III, insert the following. None of the funds made available by this act may be used by the Department of Energy to finalize, implement, or enforce the proposed rule entitled Standards.
Dispense with the reading.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on the issue of regulatory overreach, I rise today to offer a rather simple limitation amendment that will prevent increased energy consumption by consumers and allow them to continue to benefit from energy savings provided by the use of ceiling fans. You heard me right. This amendment is identical to the one that was offered by Representative Marcia Blackburn and adopted by a voice vote during floor consideration of the FY 2014 Energy and Water Bill. I'd like to thank Representative Blackburn for her continued support on this issue that we're considering again here today. Currently, the Department of Energy is processing a proposed rule entitled Standards, Ceiling Fans, and Ceiling Fan Light Kits, which would impose increased energy efficiency requirements for ceiling fans sold in the United States. So here we go again. This regulation, if implemented, would have the effect of increasing the cost of ceiling fans by nearly double, thereby reducing the purchase and use of ceiling fans by American consumers. The end result, ironically, would be heavier reliance on central heating and cooling, and thus increased energy consumption. People will simply run their air conditioners more often than they do already. Ceiling fans are energy-saving appliances which can save up to 14% on energy used to cool your home. The proposed regulation by the Department of Energy is a solution in search of a problem. The ceiling fan industry is already dedicated to energy efficiency. This commitment can be demonstrated by their continuous development of new technologies, such as a new type of motor which uses up to 70% less electricity than traditional ceiling fan motors. At a time when homeowners across the U.S. are trying to reduce energy cost and usage, we should not increase the cost of ceiling fans by setting unrealistic and unnecessary efficiency requirements on an already efficient product. Ceiling fans help reduce dependence on foreign energy sources and help support efforts to reduce greenhouse gases created by electricity production. Further, the Department of Energy regulations do not address increased stress on the national power grid when the price will impact will drive people to greater air conditioning use. Now is not the time, the economic time, to promulgate rules resulting from 101-page studies on ceiling fan efficiency that are unnecessary and costly to the end user, the American consumer. You know, the war on coal is bad enough. We don't need a war on ceiling fans. If the Department of Energy wants greater energy efficiency, we ought to start right here in Washington. Heck, why don't we start in Congress? Why not right in this room? Toggle switches. Why don't we move the dimmer switches? Why don't we have shading controls? It all costs money. By the way, we can learn a lot. Go do the Lutron experience. These people will show you how to save energy costs and increase efficiencies. It does cost money, but rather than declaring war on the ceiling fan, we should get serious about this. So I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment, which was adopted by voice vote last year in the Energy and Water Bill. So thank you for your attention and consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to oppose the gentleman's amendment, and though I oppose the amendment as offered, I understand there are legitimate concerns regarding the upcoming rule on ceiling fans, and I would be willing to work with the gentleman in addressing those concerns if he would consider withdrawing his amendment.
Well, she's yielding?
Yes, I'm yielding to you.
At this time, I am not prepared to withdraw the amendment. I appreciate the overture to negotiate a resolution, but I believe we should adopt this amendment. I doubt that the Senate, in their appropriations bill, will likely include this language, and at that point, I think would be the better time to engage in that particular negotiation at the proper time, if we get to a conference committee or whenever the negotiations will occur. But I appreciate the gentlelady's gesture.
I thank the gentleman for that clarification, and but would then like to say I think that your amendment is a solution in search of a problem. And while the Department of Energy is currently considering an update to the ceiling fan standards, no rule has even been proposed, and the earliest date that such a rule would be effective would be 2019. These standards have already saved consumers money and cut carbon pollution. Since their implementation, standards for ceiling fans and ceiling fan light kits have saved American consumers $4.5 billion in energy costs and cut greenhouse gas emissions by 22 metric tons. That is an amazing change. The Department has stated its intent to consider alternatives ranging from incremental improvements to AC motors to standards that would require DC motors. There is a strong possibility that the proposed rule would require an incremental improvement in AC motors, thereby neither necessitating the entire redesign of the ceiling fan industry nor resulting in the significant cost increases referenced by the industry. Given the proposed rule has yet to be released, industry cannot anticipate how much their manufacturing costs might increase, whether their business model would be turned upside down, or whether the rule would result in energy growth. The industry has not substantiated any of their claims. The Department of Energy has conducted extensive consultation with industry and stakeholders, and as part of the process, the Department is soliciting industry input into such factors as affordability, aesthetics, and any potential indirect effects on air conditioning use. In response to stakeholder feedback, the Department of Energy issued a request for information last year specifically requesting additional data on the potential interaction between ceiling fan and air conditioning usage. The Department is also conducting an independent study on the subject, and data from these sources will inform the ongoing analysis on the rule. As I have stated, I object to the amendment as proposed. I still extend my hand, a commitment to work on addressing the legitimate concerns concerning the details of the rule, but I do stand in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
Chairman Simpson.
What? Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment. My colleague's amendment would prohibit the use of funds at the Department of Energy to propose ceiling fan efficiency standards authorized by Congress in the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and slated to be proposed in 2015. The law in question allows for executive overreach by prescribing what industry can and cannot sell and what consumers can and cannot buy. Industry has legitimate concerns about government forcing a wholesale change to a market for something as common as ceiling fans. This amendment reins back this overreaching regulations, proposed regulations, and I support the amendment and recommend my colleagues vote yes.
Will the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
Are any of these companies that make ceiling fans domestic?
Well, I would say that the vast majority of existing U.S. manufacturers, including Lowe's, Home Depot, and Hunter Fans, currently source components from various suppliers and assemble the fans in the U.S. currently. There is only one U.S. manufacturer that makes its entire product in the U.S., and that would be...
what company is it?
That would be Big Ass Fans based in Kentucky. Only in Kentucky.
It's true. That's the name of the company. In fact, in the Lexington airport, in Lexington's where this company's from, in the Lexington airport, there's a big, huge fan in the lobby, the big lobby. It's like 20 feet across, you know? So you understand where it got its name. Mr. Kingston.
Out of abundance of caution, I'm not going to comment on the previous discussion. You know, I want you to think about the Department of Energy, created under Jimmy Carter to address the OPEC oil embargo, which caused our energy prices domestically to go up. And the idea was to get off Middle East oil because at that time I think we were importing something like 35%. Now I believe it's in the 65 to 70% range. What if the doggone Department of Energy actually focused on its mission instead of this nanny state stuff of a 206-page catalog now outlining to the good people in Kentucky and the good people all over how to build a ceiling fan? And as I understand it, the average cost of the retail doubles. $35 fan now becomes a $70 fan. And once more, the middle class doesn't get its fair shake. When President Obama took the oath of office in January 2009, do you know how much gas prices were, average pump prices? $1.87. $1.87. If this administration and the Department of Energy wanted to help the middle class of America, they would focus on their original big picture mission, which would be to develop North American energy, not this small ball stuff that is nothing but nanny state intrusion into your back porch and to stores all over the country. I support the gentleman's amendment.
There being no further discussion, Mr. Dent's recognized to close.
Well, I kind of feel like we're having one of those discussions in any state where the federal government decided we're going to regulate, toilet water usage, flush your toilet more now, all well intended, but here we are. So ceiling fans, as we know, are inexpensive, and they're an easy way to reduce home heating, cooling costs. Imposing these new unnecessary regulations on this industry will ultimately stifle innovation and double the cost, as Mr. Kingston said, hurting lower income people most of all. And by the way, I want to address one point. Without Department of Energy standards, there are 27 more Energy Star fans in the market since 2007, due simply to industry innovation and leadership. That trend's going to continue. This is without the Department of Energy sticking its nose where it doesn't need to be. The potential regulation by DOE it's going to double the cost, as has been mentioned, and frankly, on a hot day like this, where it's going to approach nearly 100 degrees, we could use our friends in Kentucky. We need a few big-ass fans around here right now. But let's pass this amendment and encourage reduced energy consumption through increased efficiency, and this amendment, I think, will take us a long way. Thank you.
Question is on the Dent amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. No. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Not sufficient number. Are there amendments? Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Fleischman. On page 128 of the committee report, under the heading Overpayments into NNSA's contractor
Chairman, I
defined.
move dispense.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this bill contains a provision that will allow the Department of Energy to use special transfer authority to pay for work needed to get the WIP operating again. There's been some misunderstanding about this provision, and valid concerns have been expressed that it would adversely affect NNSA defined benefit pension plans. This is not the case, and I'm offering an amendment to clarify it. My amendment would clarify that the source of the transfer authority will only come from advance payments by the contractor for pensions already funded at 100% and would only prevent prepayment by the contractor at levels above 100%. Mr. Chairman, my amendment would further clarify that no transfer funds should come from money already in pension plan or reduce payments below statutory requirements. Neither of these options were possible under the existing bill language, but I wanted to make sure that there is no confusion on this important issue. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Simpson.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. I'd like to thank the gentleman for his diligence on this issue by offering an amendment that will clarify concerns regarding the Department's budget request for its contractor-employee defined benefit pension plans. This bill contains a provision that allows the Department of Energy to transfer funds that it assumed it would need to pay in fiscal year 2015 as a cost of doing business at the NNSA National Laboratories. Over the past few years, we've seen the Department overestimate the costs of its pension plans in the budget request and end up with large windfalls when those costs do not materialize. This year, the Special Transfer Authority will allow the Department to transfer those savings to Defense Environmental Cleanup, where it will be needed to pay for the recovery of the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, WIP. The Department is still investigating an incident that would shut down operations at the facility in February, and those recovery costs are still evolving. It's a high priority for me that WIP is returned to full and safe operations as soon as possible. Since all committee and House members were not able to read the report language which accompanies the bill when it was released, there are some misunderstandings regarding the funding source of the Special Transfer Authority and expressions of concern that it would adversely affect contributions made into the Department's contractor employee pension plans. However, I'd like to assure members that the full funding provided for individual activities in this bill will meet all requirements for contractor employee pensions, which are contractual obligations assumed by the Department as part of its maintenance and operating contracts. The gentleman's amendment is important, and again, I'd like to thank the gentleman for his work on this issue in that it will narrow the direction in the report to apply only to those advanced payments for plans that are already very well funded. The gentleman's amendment will also make sure that the Department does not take advantage of the report language to shortchange payments to those plans where there is a credible, resource-informed justification for making those advanced payments. The gentleman is doing a great service to make certain these oversight actions do not unintentionally adversely impact his constituents. I support this amendment and hope all members do.
Is there further discussion? Hearing none. Mr. Fleischman is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Simpson, as well. Again, to my colleagues, this is just a clarification of existing policy, and it does what is very important, I think, make sure the hard-working men and women who work for our contractors across this great nation, not only in Oak Ridge and Idaho, across this great nation, have their concerns addressed and make sure that their pensions are kept safe. With that, I yield back.
Question is on the Fleischman amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Graves.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I rise today to extend the long tradition that we as a committee have had in bipartisan support of an amendment over the last 3 years, providing law-abiding citizens the opportunity to protect and defend themselves on Corps of Engineer properties, and building really upon legislation that was passed in 2009 that with bipartisan support and signed into law by the President that allowed for this same protection to be provided to those on National Park Service land and National Wildlife Refuge properties as well. So again, just building upon our spirit of bipartisanship, I want to ask for your support of this amendment.
Chairman Simpson.
Mr. Chairman, I support this amendment. As the gentleman stated, current regulations prohibit citizens from exercising their Second Amendment rights on Corps land. Many people don't realize it, but the Corps is the largest federal provider of outdoor recreation. This amendment would simply align Corps policy with the policy established by Congress for national parks and national wildlife refuges in 2009, as the gentleman stated. Therefore, I support this amendment and urge its adoption.
Mrs. Lowy.
Mr. Chairman, I strongly oppose the gentleman's amendment. This notion that the Corps' policy disenfranchises gun owners simply is not true. Current law prohibits the private possession of a loaded firearm unless the weapon is being used for hunting, fishing, or target shooting in designated areas. And if for some reason an individual needs to carry a private firearm in a non-designated area, the Corps has a process to follow that as well. The reason the Corps does not allow for the private possession of firearms is because Corps projects are critical infrastructure facilities like dams, locks, powerhouses that are important to commercial operations along our waterways. These are the very type of facilities that we want to protect from a terrorist attack. Furthermore, Corps personnel are not trained law enforcement officers. They don't carry guns or make arrests. Their responsibilities are managing and maintaining the properties. Allowing individuals to walk around with guns in non-designated areas only injects national security concerns into the operation of the projects and forces untrained, ill-equipped Corps personnel to be hypersensitive to the threat of an attack. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
Is there further, Mr. Pisklewski?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I do not believe in all my years on the committee I've ever spoken on a gun amendment on the theory that it's not going to change anybody's mind here, and I don't presume I'm going to today. But I would just point out that annually about 370 million Americans visit and revisit Army Corps recreational facilities. And I don't think 370 million people visit those facilities because they feel they're endangered and need to be armed. I would also point out that since December 12th, 2012, in the Newtown school shooting, we've had 74 school shootings in the United States of America. In the 113th Congress, we have had at least 7 moments of silence for those who died in gun attacks. In this Congress, since May 28th, we've had 3 moments of silence in the House of Representatives for people killed by gun violence. If we would use some of that time in this Congress to have a reasonable policy within the strictures of the Second Amendment, maybe we could cut down on the number of moments of silence. I yield back my time.
Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I truly respect the opinions of the other side, and might I point out that in each of those horrific violent cases, none of those were committed by law-abiding citizens. This amendment clearly just allows for law-abiding citizens obeying the laws within their own states to properly defend themselves on Corps property, whether that's camping, hiking, boating, whatever that might be. But in no case would this allow them to enter a dam or a federal facility with a firearm, as is provided for in another section of federal law. So again, I would point out this is all about law-abiding Americans being able to defend and protect themselves as afforded by the Second Amendment.
Question is, I didn't realize the gentlelady wanted to speak.
I wanted to allow my colleagues some airtime, Mr. Chairman.
I yield to you.
I thank the chairman very much, and I rise in strong opposition to the amendment offered by our colleague from Georgia. And I understand the intent of the gentleman's amendment is to prohibit the Corps from preventing individuals from having handguns on projects administered by the Corps. And I suppose in some realms that's a good political issue. I really don't believe that allowing handgun-toting individuals to walk around Corps-administered dams and water treatment plants is a very good idea. Our government allows hunting on vast stretches of federal lands, some in my district, in wildlife refuges. We have shooting ranges that we operate, including on some specified Corps properties. And in fact, I represent, not on Corps property, but on other property, the National Rifle Range, where the national shooting matches are held every year. So we have, and that happens to be on a guard-related property in the state of Ohio. So we have plenty of places where people can take their guns, either for shooting or for hunting. But I'm somewhat thinking about this amendment and the fact that these school shootings seem to engender sometimes a collective shrug from the media. I think one news personality said something to the effect of, well, it's another day, another school shooting, and that maybe the American people are being inoculated in a way that is really very dangerous to the kind of country we want to live in. Should families that are trying to just have a few days of enjoyment have to worry about the possibility that their children enjoying recreation areas provided by the Corps have to worry about this now, the gentleman's amendment? I think it's another amendment in search of a problem. Corps lands are safe, and regulations currently allow individuals to possess firearms on lands managed by the Corps of Engineers as they are rendered inaccessible. The firearms simply have to be unloaded and placed somewhere that is not easily reachable, such as in a car trunk. Also on Corps properties, as I've said, firearms are allowed in designated hunting areas and shooting ranges. Maybe the gentleman is unaware of those. Hunters who are camping can have unloaded guns at their campsite, but cannot load ammunition until they enter the designated hunting areas. You know, that's really a safer way to do it. In Ohio, we have a lot of deer that are running all over the place. I don't want somebody just running out with a gun in some of these areas that are not designated. Some bad things happen in areas that are, unfortunately, the public is unaware. Hunters who respect firearms are hunters that we want in our region. Those that are just running around for whatever reason, we don't want. I think the Corps has this controlled already. I oppose your amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same.
Mr. Farr?
Mr. Chairman, I just find us being such hypocrites. A minute ago, we were arguing that we ought to have states' rights and government shouldn't tell you how you have to live your life and get into these micro issues. I think this amendment is addressing something that's not broken and doesn't need to be fixed for the purposes that just were stated by Ms. Capter, that there are allowed hunting areas within the Corps of Engineers. Look, what we've seen in this committee, and I think it's not really appropriate because it's legislating on appropriation bills, is this gun creep. We had this debate on national parks, allowing you to take guns into parks. I mean, there's been a lot of negative reaction to that people don't want to be in parks with people with guns around. We have, on this amendment, I think in California we represent more NRA members than any other state. I've not had one person complain that that they need to see this, that this is something we need to fix. So we've allowed legislating on appropriations bills for national parks and for BLM land, and now you're trying to get on the Corps of Engineers land. I think it's just going too far. Aren't we listening to the cries of this country that are saying we don't need more guns, we need more gun control laws? And California probably has more NRA members, more gun owners, more guns than any other state. And yet we have the toughest gun laws in the United States. And people are operating. I mean, it hasn't shut down the state. People aren't complaining. It's working. I think that we take these amendments sometimes very lightly. It has very serious implications. And I would argue that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We don't need to pass this amendment.
Is there further discussion? If not, Mr. Graves is recognized for a minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And certainly, as I said before, I respect the opinions of the other side. This is about law-abiding Americans who have been afforded the Second Amendment right to properly defend themselves. This has nothing to do with some of the things that have been stated here, such as allowing individuals to carry firearms on federal property in a federal facility. That's not what this is about. This is about allowing individuals to defend themselves. So I would suggest to those who believe in the idea that a firearm that is kept with somebody out of reach without ammunition, I would submit to you that is not a proper defense, an opportunity for someone to defend themselves. And we should all be about our constituents choosing whether or not they defend themselves and not having to worry about imaginary boundaries. Are they on this property or on that property? Oh, had I been over here, I could have defended myself, but unfortunately now I'm over here and the federal government says I can't. As to states' rights, you're absolutely right. But this amendment allows for states' laws to be what is governed on this core property. So whatever the state's concealed carry laws are, whatever the state's gun laws are, that's what would be seen on these Corps of Engineer properties. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Question is on the Graves amendment. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no.
No.
The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Is a roll call requested? Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Aye. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, aye. Mr. Bishop. Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert. Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Aye. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cole. Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Crenshaw. Aye. Mr. Crenshaw, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Aye. Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Culberson. Aye. Mr. Culberson, aye. Ms. DeLauro. No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent. Aye. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Farr.
No.
Mr. Farr, no. Mr. Fatah. Mr. Fleischman. Aye. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Yes. Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Mr. Feelinghuisen. Aye. Mr. Feelinghuisen, aye. Ms. Granger. Aye. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Aye. Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris. Aye. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Ferrer-Butler. Yes. Ms. Ferrer-Butler, aye. Mr. Honda. Yes. Mr. Honda, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter?
No.
Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kingston? Mr. Kingston, aye. Mr. Latham? Mr. Latham, aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy?
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, no. Mr. Moran?
No.
Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Nunnally? Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens, aye. Mr. Pastor? Mr. Pastor, no. Ms. Pingree?
No.
Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney, aye. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, aye. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mr. Wolf? Mr. Wolf, aye. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder? Mr. Yoder, aye.
Mr. Fatah?
Is Mr. Fatah,
Are
no.
there other members who wish to be recorded or change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the yeas are 31, the nays are 18. The amendment is agreed to. Does Mr. Fatah have someone you would like to introduce to the group?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do. We have a distinguished visitor today. My 10-year-old daughter is with me, Chandler Faith Fatah. Will she rise?
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Welcome. Mr. Moran.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read.
Amendment offered by Mr. Moran, page 10, beginning on line 11, strike section 105.
All right, so, Mr.
No one's
Chairman.
recognized.
Thank you. This language in the bill that I think should be struck would prevent the Corps of Engineers from updating regulations pertaining to the definitions of the terms fill material or discharge of fill material for the purposes of the Clean Water Act. There are several different permits the Corps issues under the Clean Water Act for placing material into the waters of the United States. Now, when Congress first enacted the Clean Water Act, the permit process for dumping into water bodies was supposed to be used for certain construction projects, like bridges and roads, where raising the bottom elevation of a water body or converting an area into dry land was unavoidable. But then some attorneys in the last Bush administration found a clever way to allow mining waste to be dumped into rivers and streams without an environmental review process. They just changed the definition of what qualifies as fill material. So under this 2002 rule change, the Bush administration broadened the definition to include rock, sand, soil, clay, plastics, construction debris, wood chips, and overburden from mining or other excavation activities. Now, when Congress first enacted the Clean Water Act, and for the first 30 years since its passage, the law helped keep America's lakes, rivers, and streams from mining pollution, protecting wildlife and humans' drinking water. But that's no longer the case today. Now, the number of miles of streams that have been buried or impaired by mountain valley fills is now more than 2,000 miles. Downstream water users have every right to be concerned that this new defined permitting process is failing to protect them from the discharge of hazardous substances. Now, this permitting process for large-scale surface mining has dramatically expanded under this new definition. And it's with serious health problems. Numerous peer-reviewed studies that have appeared in highly regarded scientific journals have linked large-scale surface mining with serious health problems. And those studies show a positive correlation between the prevalence and intensity of mining and the prevalence of cancer, mortality from cancer, kidney disease, birth defects, mortality from cardiovascular and pulmonary disease, impaired function due to health problems, and mortality in general. Some studies have shown that people living near mountaintop removal mines are 50% more likely to die of cancer and 42% more likely to be born with birth defects compared with other people in Appalachia due to the toxic material in their drinking water. So it seems to be in the interest of protecting the public from unsafe drinking water, which in fact is our responsibility under the Clean Air Act. I would urge support of this amendment, Mr. Chairman.
I strongly oppose the amendment. It would strike the amendment would strike Section 105, which permanently prohibits the Corps from changing the definition of, quote, fill material and, quote, discharge of fill material for purposes of the Clean Water Act. The Fiscal 14 Act included a one-year prohibition, but environmentalists have urged the administration to change these definitions in order to effectively stop most mining activities. And the administration has not been shy about its desire to wipe out our nation's use of fossil energy resources. In fact, the so-called war on coal is real. Mining permits in Kentucky have ground to a halt. Oil and gas leasing on federal lands in our Outer Banks are stagnant. Onerous regulations are shuttering power plants. And EPA officials have gone on the record expressing a desire to, quote, crucify, quote, the fossil industries, which have been the backbone of our energy security for decades. We're already reaping the rewards of these regulatory attacks. In my region of eastern Kentucky alone, we've lost about 8,000 coal jobs since the president took office. Kentucky coal production has fallen to its lowest since 1965. And these losses have hurt hard-working, mining families, communities, and the budgets of state and local governments as coal excise severance revenues have fallen off a cliff. It's my understanding that the EPA or the Corps has a rule stashed in a desk drawer at the ready to tighten the definition of fill material in such a way as to essentially ban new mining projects under the Clean Water Act. Indeed, some members of this House have written letters urging the agency to issue that rule. As a result, this bill's prohibition of a new fill definition rulemaking is crucial to protecting the hundreds of thousands of mining jobs and more than 1 million other jobs in related industries that would be threatened by additional regulatory attacks. And I dare say there will come a time, if this continues, when you will see brownouts in your state. You'll see blackouts in your state, because still yet more than half of America's electricity is generated by coal. You cut that out of the picture, imagine what's going to happen. As we've heard time and again, as new regulations and other plans are announced, the President is intent on killing the coal industry. If this administration had its way, Americans would be unable to mine coal, burn coal, or export coal. And during a time of sustained high unemployment, And in some of my counties, it's 20 and 25% because of this action. These policies will serve only to add thousands to the unemployment lines by killing an industry, raise the cost of energy for American families, and make domestic manufacturing dependent on affordable electricity less competitive. As a result, I urge a no vote on this amendment. Ms. Kaptur.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I rise to support the gentleman's amendment, but let me begin by saying, Mr. Chairman, no one could identify with the economic plight of communities such as you represent in Kentucky than myself in the industrial belt along the Great Lakes. We understand what unemployment is. We understand what shutdown utility plants are, and that's one of the reasons this bill is so terribly important, to help America transition in a way that creates jobs here at home, but also protects human health. And one of the sad aspects of the mark we've been given is we can't really be creative in creating adjustment programs, whether they be scientific programs to transition the power that's contained in the BTUs of coal in a clean way, or adjustment for job loss in places where utility plants are being shut down, to provide them with the means to readjust quickly. We've been asked to put too many angels on the head of a very small pin here, and now we're fighting about regulations. But the real answer is to provide us with the kind of resources and the adjustment authorities that would make life in Kentucky much better and life in Ohio much better. We have a current situation in Ohio right now where our governor is fighting the renewable energy standard in Ohio. How ridiculous is that in a world where China is stealing our photovoltaic technology? What sense does that make? We have to be able to muster up for this country and use our bill effectively. And though I understand the gentleman's good intentions on trying to protect his citizenry, believe me, I would do the same. I understand that. But I can tell you that in Ohio and other places, we've had, because of climate change, terrible choices to make, for instance, about our water systems, where toxic algal blooms have corroded water intakes, and literally we have had to shut off water to townships. Clean water is very important to us. That never happened before. We've never had to do that in our area because of what is happening up in the Great Lakes due to climate change. I represent communities that have PCBs buried in waterways that are left over from manufacturing in years past, and very dangerous heavy metals that were buried in streams before that we need to clean up. And frankly, science doesn't know how to do it effectively without pushing that stuff up into the water system itself. So I think Mr. Moran's amendment is very, very well intentioned, and I just wish we had the authority and the funding to increase the Appalachian Regional Commission, its ability to do development, to help you transition your communities, to help us in places like Ohio to transition our coal-fired utilities to renewable production, which we are infinitely capable of doing. We simply don't have the financing nor the institutional mechanisms to do that right now. So I urge my colleagues to support the Moran amendment. Fresh water is a precious resource and one that we must protect into the future, but I can completely identify with the plight of Kentuckians, and I yield back.
Mr. Culberson.
Mr. Chairman, I join you and the chairman in opposing this amendment. And Houston, Texas is to the oil and gas industry what Silicon Valley is to the computer industry. And one of my oil and gas executives told me recently he went to the White House to one of these business roundtables, and as he was walking out with President Obama, he said, "You know, Mr. President, you're the luckiest man on earth." And President Obama said, "Why?" And my oil and gas executive said, "Because you are president during the largest discovery of mineral wealth in the history of the world." And President Obama said, "I have no interest in fossil fuels. We're going to move into renewables and solar and electric and all this," and just dismissed the guy and walked away. It's important for us all to remember that in the last 10 years, America's oil and gas industry, our scientists and engineers have discovered more oil and gas in the last 10 years than has ever been discovered in the history of the United States. All the oil and gas executives that I know, and if you talk to any of them in your district or anywhere in the country, they'll tell you that if we would just unleash them and get out of the way, that they will make America energy independent in 5 years. That's an extraordinary achievement. But the White House and his Democrat supporters are determined to block American energy independence. It's not just a war on coal, Mr. Chairman. The White House and the Democrat Party have a war on American energy independence. And it's intensely destructive and damaging to the American economy, to the strength of America around the world, especially at a time when the White House is allowing the most dangerous fanatics on earth to establish a new caliphate in Iraq and allowing our enemies around the world to destabilize the Middle East. It's extremely important for America to be energy independent as quickly as humanly possible. So I strongly support what you've done in this bill, Mr. Simpson, and urge colleagues to oppose this amendment and join with us in reining in this out-of-control EPA and do everything in our power to make sure that America becomes energy independent as quickly as humanly possible. Thank you.
Mr. Farr.
Mr. Chairman, I support that statement that we ought to become energy independent as quickly as possible. I just don't support the idea that we have to do it with coal and oil and gas. There is a bigger problem, and that is this is this clean air issue, and you take it lightly, but that clean air is air that's covering the world, and that air is also as a carbon sequestration in our oceans. And you don't think much about it, but our oceans are beginning to show signs of dying. When the oceans, which cover 74% of the world, die, we die as human beings. This is really a problem. This global warming is an issue. And we've got to face it, that we've got to find different ways of carbon sequestration and not just burning and more and putting more up. I mean, California, obviously, the biggest user of energy in the state. Most people driving cars and living in their fancy lives, and as we went through the energy crisis, always claiming, oh, all those Californians out there sitting in their hot tubs drinking Merlot. But you know what? We're also the state that's already met goals that 20% of the state, 30% of the state energy has to be produced by alternative forms, solar, wind, geothermal, things like that, renewable energies. And it's already ahead of its goal, already ahead of its goal. And if you don't think, I mean, you compared the oil and gas industry in Texas to Silicon Valley, who's pushing that? The innovation in America, the brain trust of where we go to be competitive in this world is in the energy field. And it ain't in the oil and gas business, and it ain't in the coal business. That's why Tesla is now ranked the best car on the road, and it's, all electric. And even though its price is outrageously expensive, it's going to be, it'll be the type of vehicle that you're going to see people buying in the next decade. Look.
With the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
Where does Mr. Tesla get his electricity?
He gets it from electrons, which are provided by solar energy, geothermal energy, wind energy, biomass energy, all the alternatives. There are lots of ways of generating electrons that doesn't have to be just from coal or gas. I defend we all defend our own interests. We all have special interests. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think when we also ignore that there are adverse consequences to defending those interests, we ought to also take those into consideration. Look, we're the United States Congress. We're not the state legislature or the local chamber of commerce. And protection of our environment and our clean air, that's an incredible policy that we created. Congress has only twice in history come up with environmental policies. One was clean water and the other was clean air. And we ought to be defending those actions of Congress, not trying to hurt them. And I think that amendments like this are good ones to adopt. And I just ask that we think of ourselves in a greater form than just a world of future of dependence on petroleum and coal. There are alternatives, and it's in our best interest that we pursue those.
Judge Carter.
I'm just looking at a chart somebody provided here. I don't know who provided it. Oh, yeah. I don't know who provided this chart. this capture provides this chart. Just looking at it, natural gas provides 38% of our energy. Crude oil and natural gas plant liquids, 20%. Coal, 22%. Leading renewables has grown in 1980 from, looks like 9%, all the way to 12% by 2040, the projection by 2040. I don't know how we're going to run things if we eliminate the hydrocarbons of natural gas, crude oil, and coal. And yes, there is nuclear at 10%. Maybe that's the solution, but if you don't like our waste products, you're really not going to like their waste products. So I think we ought to think about this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Wasserman-Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was not going to speak this entire meeting and try to choose my words carefully and speak sparingly so that they have perhaps more impact. But I think it would behoove all of us, when we do debate on a particular topic, not to stray too far from the subject matter at hand. My good friend from Texas went a little far afield of the subject matter of this amendment to suggest that our Commander-in-Chief is doing anything other than making sure that we can protect our national security interests in Iraq, which have deteriorated to the point where those are obviously that's obviously a very challenging situation, has nothing whatsoever to do with this amendment. And, you know, this is a committee that, in the years I've been on it, has strived to work together and be bipartisan. You know, to say nothing of the fact that had we not gone into Iraq in the first place and broken that country worse than it was before, we probably wouldn't be dealing with the mess that is there right now. And many of my colleagues and friends on the other side of the aisle were enthusiastic supporters of going in. So let's just, you know, a little reminder on how we got where we are today. Lastly, just on the subject matter at hand, I would not have strayed had that not occurred. You know, we have had an explosion in asthma among children in this country, given that we continue to have an increasingly large problem with global warming and climate change and the impacts of carbon on our environment. The administration has an all of the above, an appropriate all of the above energy strategy, and while it's pretty clear that we are not going to, nor is it responsible for us to stop using fossil fuels, with all due respect to my colleague from California. We do have to recognize that each of those fossil fuels is finite. They may not get used up in our lifetime, but if we're going to think about the future and the fact that we need to make sure that generations from now we are able to generate energy and continue to generate energy in an affordable way, we're going to have to make investments in alternative energy and renewable energy and stop sticking our heads in the sand that we're going to have this, you know, inexhaustible supply of fossil fuels that at the same time is harming our environment, making our children sick, and contributing to the fact that in my community in South Florida, there has been 9 inches of sea level rise since the 1920s. At some point, I'm going to end up representing Orlando because there won't be a coastline in South Florida and in many other places in this country. So we have to work together. We have to stop going to our respective corners and insisting that, no, carbon is a problem, no, it isn't a problem. We can find some common ground in the middle if we just stop beating the stuff out of each other. So that was in the for what it's worth column, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for your time. Yield back.
Chairman Simpson.
Mr. Chairman, I first want to say that I appreciate the gentleman from California's comments about wanting to become energy independent, except for coal, oil, and natural gas. I guess that means white potatoes and potato batteries. You guys have all seen those work. They do work. Fields and fields of potato batteries, we could become energy independent. Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. The language in the bill is intended simply to maintain the status quo regarding what fill material is for the purposes of Clean Water Act. The existing definition was put in place through a rulemaking initiated by the Clinton administration initiated by the Clinton administration and finalized by the Bush administration. That rule aligned the definitions on the books of the Corps and the EPA so that both agencies were working with the same definition. Changing the definition again, as some would propose, could effectively kill mining operations across much of the country. You know, it's interesting that this really isn't about fill material. That's really not what the debate is. A lot of these proposals and these rules aren't meant to address what the rules are about. They're meant to address something else. And what this is meant to address by changing this is try to kill the use of coal. That's what it is. It's not about fill material. Yet that's what we use as a means to get at coal. I think it's wrong. For those reasons, I support the underlying language and oppose this amendment.
Mr. Moran is recognized for a minute to close.
These rules, which allowed the dumping of mountaintops in streams for the purpose of coal mining, have now resulted in the loss of 1,944 kilometers of headwater streams in Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Virginia. That's triple the length of the Potomac River. The concentrations of toxic chemical ions are 10 times higher downstream in the water that comes from these mountaintop mining removal projects than the water from unmined watersheds. So 10 times more toxic in terms of the water. Now, this type of mining does generate $8 billion in jobs, taxes, and other economic benefits. But, Mr. Chairman, the cost to the public health, including premature death, equals $42 billion. So it's 5 times more. It seems to me that we know the heavy cost of mountaintop mining removal when it's allowed to be dumped into our streams, which then flow into water that we have to drink. So I urge support for the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Question is on the Moran amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no.
No.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments? If not, Mr. Chairman Wolf is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I move to favorably report the Energy and Water Appropriation Bill for fiscal year 2015 to the House.
You've heard the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be given the authority to make technical and conforming change to the items approved today. Without objection, so ordered. 3 days will be recognized to the minority. If there's no further business, the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you.
Frank, you're going to give me a copy of your letter?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, here's your copy. Yeah.
Thank you very much.